Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Good to have all of you here. We'll jump right in. My name is Beth Bromley. I'm happy to introduce today Dr. Neely Myers for a Grand Rounds presentation. Neely Myers is a medical and psychological anthropologist and associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Southern Methodist University, with an adjunct position in the Department of Psychiatry at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. She completed a PhD in comparative human development at the University of Chicago, studying under the direction of Drs. Tanya Luhrmann, Kim Hopper, Sue Estroff, and others. Her focus has always been on psychosis experiences, particularly in young people, not just in the US, but internationally, as her work builds on a strong and generative scholarly relationship that goes back at least to the mid-20th century between mental health practitioners and anthropologists. Her first book, entitled Recovery's Edge, an ethnography of mental health care and moral agency from 2015, is an ethnographic portrait of an urban outpatient mental health clinic seeking to provide recovery-oriented care. The book describes masterfully the contradictions and promises that come up on the ground, particularly with regard to the potential for building ethical and enlivening relationships with our patients. She listens closely and carefully to not just those experiencing psychosis, but also to those professionals trying to provide good care within inadequate and challenging service contexts. Her work aiming to understand how to improve access and service engagement for young people experiencing mental distress has been funded by NIMH, as well as by a number of foundations. Her second book, tentatively titled Breaking Points, Youth in Crisis and Refusals of Care, is currently under review at the University of California Press. Given the crisis in youth mental health in the US, it could not be more timely. But I suspect her book will also speak to enduring concerns and our always important efforts to make our mental health care system become more welcoming, caring, responsive, and ethical. I'm very excited to hear her talk today. I thank you for welcoming her because of the excellent work and because she's just a phenomenal colleague, friend, and supporter of our work in mental health, and it's a pleasure to know her. Looking forward to her talk. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that lovely introduction. So I will go ahead and begin the task at hand. So today I will be talking, can everyone see? I actually can't see anyone. Can you see my slides? Oh, you're not. Okay. Well, hopefully everyone can see my slides. So today my presentation is called Breaking Points, Improving Engagement for Young Adults Experiencing Early Psychosis. And I'm going to make three main points. The first is that a concept that I call moral agency is important for mental health and social belonging. The second is that my data suggests that the manifestation of and societal response to young persons experiencing early psychosis constitute breaking points that have both medical and moral dimensions. And the third is that I'm going to argue that to better engage young persons in treatment, we need to focus on addressing a young person's moral and medical needs during a critical time after their initial diagnosis. So
Neely, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're not able to see your slides.
Uh-oh.
I wonder if you could try again to share.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Let me try that again. Thank you for letting me know. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. How about now?
Perfect.
Okay,
Looks
great.
Great. Yep. I think
right.
In the chat, others able as well to see. Okay. Great. Thank you, Neely.
Thank you, everyone, for the good feedback. Okay, so just to introduce briefly the sort of motivation for my work. This is a photo of my family. I'm about 14 years old here, and this is just a few months before the state of Georgia removed my younger brother from our home for had been diagnosed with paranoid childhood onset schizophrenia. And so all of the work that I do is inspired by my experiences with my family and with my younger brother. And so I just wanted to thank him as we get started. So over the years, my journey has evolved into an intellectual project, which is both anthropological and clinical. So I'm very invested in researching how social context shapes mental illness and health. And I'm interested in how social context shapes the experience, the understanding, the social response, the treatment, and also outcomes. And so I just want to acknowledge right up front that there are a lot of contested terms and identity politics around what I study. And so this is a list of the different kinds of terms that we see coming from different groups with different ideas about how they should be identified. And there's a great deal of controversy around all these different kinds of terms. But today I just want to state that for this particular study, I was looking at young adults, 18 to 30, who have had what we were calling unusual mental events in our IRB consent forms, but that have been labeled by clinicians as early psychosis, as psychosis NOS, or mostly psychosis NOS. So for those of you who aren't familiar, although I'm sure most of you are, psychosis involves several different kinds of symptoms. One is positive symptoms. So this is an image from the Prinzhorn collection at the University of Heidelberg, showing how the artist, Jacob Moore, who was in the asylum, he was a patient there, and he felt that a radio operator was shooting arrows of harm into and around through his body. You can see that on kind of the lower level and also on the upper level. And this was part of what we would call a delusion. And so this is the kinds of symptoms that some of the young people I worked with were experiencing, hallucinations and delusions. And then also they were experiencing negative symptoms. So this is another depiction by an artist who's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, John Hood. And I think it sort of captures some of the experiences of possibly lacking motivation, or lacking the ability to experience pleasure, or having an inability to convey emotions that you're feeling very strongly with your facial expression. So these are some of the things that the young people I was working with were experiencing. And in this research, I take a dual approach. So I'm an anthropologist, so I'm looking to identify patterns across the ways that people talk about their lives that can help give us some hints about how they adapt and flourish in spite of struggling with these distressing kinds of symptoms. And I make comparisons about these across cultures. So I've worked in the US and in Tanzania, but I'm only talking today about my more recent work in the US. I'm also a mental health services researcher, so I work mostly with the National Institute of Mental Health to try and apply this theory in ways that can really help us support patients and families as they try to adapt. So my first point today is that moral agency is important for mental health and social belonging. And this builds on the work from my first book that Dr. Bromley so wonderfully introduced, called Recovery's Edge. And for this book, I did research in an undisclosed area of the US, an urban area. And I started by looking at how there were persons who had lived experience of schizophrenia. They identified as having lived experience. How they were defining recovery. So what did they think it meant to have this diagnosis, but then go on to live a meaningful and fulfilling life? And so here I have several photos of folks who are, I think you're familiar with Ellen Sachs, probably, the law professor at USC. But also there's, I talk to judges and psychologists and psychiatrists and many activists who identified as people in recovery, and asked them, what did they do to kind of get better? And then I also did this 3-year ethnographic project from the ground up, looking at people who had long-term psychiatric disability and peer specialists. That's a much more common term now. This is one of the first programs to try to do this in the US, but looking at peer specialists and how they try to promote recovery for their clients, who were widely people with long-term psychiatric disability, who'd experienced homelessness, long-term substance use. So this was a major challenge for them. And what I found is that it was really difficult to recover, according to both the activists and the people trying to help this happen on the ground and facilitate it, when people didn't have access to what I called moral agency. So it's moral because it's based on local moral worlds and what it means to be a good enough person in a particular social context. And that can really vary. It depends on who you want to belong to and who you identify as your people and who you would like to have intimate relationships with. And it's agency because you have to be able to act in the way that the local people define as good enough in order to make intimate connections with other people. So we see this kind of moral agency playing out in many areas of everyday life. And I think that it affects people with long-term psychiatric disability, as well as, I will argue, young people with early psychosis, and really any of us who are trying to make our way in the world. And so, for example, all of us need to have a certain amount of moral agency in the workplace, where we need to be able to convince our coworkers that we're good enough people to have a long-term relationship, to invest in each other and collaborations and things like that. We need to have moral agency in the context of a marriage. We need our in-laws to think that we're good enough people to join their family. When we try to join community groups, here I have pictured a community drumming circle, that, you know, people want to have good people involved with them, and people will shut you out if they don't think you're good enough to join. And also places of worship are another place where moral agency is important. Here we have people worshiping in a mosque. And from my research, I distilled down 3 key aspects of moral agency that are operating, at least in the US, and those are autobiographical power, the social basis of self-respect, or peopled opportunities. So I gave this presentation to my daughter. She's about 15, and she said, "Mom, those are a lot of big words." And she's a theater kid, so she thought I should try to put this in the terms of theater. So autobiographical power is when you are trying to at least be a playwright of your own life, or the editor of your own life. You're trying to craft a self in the world that feels good to you, that feels like that represents well the person that you're trying to be and the people that you're trying to attract. And then you have to build an audience for that person. So you're trying to secure from that audience the social basis of self-respect, so that they agree mutually that you are worth being respected, that your idea of yourself is respectable, and that they will welcome you into their to having relationships like marriages and work, employment, and being willing to have, you know, a landlord, things like that. And then also you have to have an opportunity to practice your role. So we don't all just get it right the first time. We have to step out and practice and try and fail and try again. And people have to be willing to give us the opportunity to do that. So when I was doing this work for my first book, I noticed that people in recovery in the psychosocial rehabilitation organization where I worked, they were trying to acquire some moral agency within this social context. And they were able to acquire moral agency as peers, peer specialists, people who were not using substances, people who took their medications, and people who were trying to seek out work or volunteer opportunities. And I noticed that was easier for some people to do than others, and that these kinds of efforts, even if they acquired moral agency within the rehabilitation program, for example, on the right here, we have, these are not photos of real people, by the way, none of these photos are actual people. They're just effervescences of people. And so on the right, we have someone who was a chief peer specialist in the organization. He had a lot of moral agency within the context of the building, but as his life started to fall apart, when his medication became toxic to his kidneys and he had to change medication and things began to unravel, he started using substances again, became homeless again. He didn't really have, you know, he lost a lot of moral agency. And then on the left, we have a person who was doing really well in the program, and he actually was teaching a happiness class across the organization that a lot of clients and staff members attended and really enjoyed. It was a multi-part series of philosophy classes, but when he tried to do that in the community, at a local coffee shop with just regular people, a lot of people showed up to the first class and then no one came back. So it was very difficult for people to establish themselves as moral agents in the outside world. So moral agency is a key driver of recovery, and being able to act in a way that others recognize as good makes possible intimate relationships with others. And a lot of people, I argue in my book, who have had long-term psychiatric disability really need that kind of support at the beginning of their efforts to recover and not the end. So after I finished this research, I became really interested in what early psychosis looks like. So I was working with people who'd had long-term negative fallout from their experiences of psychiatric disability, homelessness, substance use, broken relationships with families, lost opportunities, employment, educational opportunities. So I was wondering, what happens right at the front end when people first become ill, and how do we support or not support them in ways that help them move forward with their lives? And lucky for me, around this time, early intervention services was becoming a very popular and prominent idea in psychiatry in the US. And as my project developed at the time, there was a 5%, now it's 10% of the federal budget to states is allocated for early intervention services for psychosis. And so we see these programs rising up all over the country. And some of the earlier research suggests that they can prevent longer-term negative outcomes like interpersonal violence, suicide, rehospitalizations, and Medicaid costs seem to be less for people who are using early intervention services in the long run. And so there's been a big investment by the federal government in these programs. So some of the early research that I did on these programs and that other people have done suggests that just because we have the programs doesn't mean that people show up for them. And so in general, mental health, about 50% of young people don't show up for follow-up appointments after an initial hospitalization for psychosis. And then more specifically, even when you offer very specialized early intervention services, only about 30% of people show up for follow-up services. And so at the time, the NIH wanted to know how young people make decision about treatment around this early time, and what we could do to sort of make these services more attractive to them. And so I designed a project that was funded by the NIMH, and I was able to do this project in Dallas, Texas, which is pictured here, with a variety of young people. And so just because this is a psychiatry audience, I'll be very specific. We were looking particularly at the critical period, which is thought to be crucial for improving outcomes for young people. And so at the time, it was really thought to be the first 3 months after your initial diagnosis of psychosis. So we met young people in the hospital, and we excluded anyone who had had more than 3 months of antipsychotic medication. And we excluded anyone who had been hospitalized for any kind of psychosis, even psychosis NOS, more than 3 months before we met them. So we really were trying to capture people during this critical time very early on. The initial interview was in the hospital after we had clearance from the treatment team that the person was stable and ready to talk and open to talking. They did the initial kind of screening for us. And then we followed them for up to 6 months for 4 follow-up home visits, sometimes in the community. These were open-ended, person-centered interviews with a young person, and ideally their key supporter, asking what mattered to them, how did they make decisions during this time. So we were able to recruit 48 young people. They're pretty evenly split gender-wise. We did not ask about non-binary or other gender affiliations. We just let people self-identify, but everyone at this time and in place, chose a male or female gender. They were around 23 years old on average. There was a good distribution across socioeconomic statuses. About half were middle to upper middle class, half were, lower income. And about 73% of them were from racially minoritized groups. So we had 40% Latino, 30% Black, and 16% white. And 50% of them were also immigrants. So 23% first generation and 27% second generation. So it was a very diverse group. And this was intentional. We were trying to sample in a way that was inclusive and really spoke to experiences that weren't restricted to white upper middle class families, which is where a lot of research comes from in this area. And we also were able to recruit 19 key supporters. While they were able to really choose anyone, by and large, they chose their mom. And so 2/3 of the key supporters were female and a parent. We also interviewed 12 mental health providers who specialize in working with minoritized groups in the North Texas area, and 16 Black pastors who were working on engaging Black youth and families around mental health issues. So I just want to own that there's a lot of intersectionality in this group because of the diversity. Immigrants, I have some of the research here that's suggesting, mostly from the UK and Europe, but we're working on doing stronger research on this in the US, but there is evidence that immigrants are more at risk for developing psychosis, and we had, half of our study involved immigrants, and that being from an ethno-racially minoritized group can result in a longer duration of untreated psychosis, more negative and complex pathways to care that include really really a catalytic event, an emergency, and then police intervention. And the engagement is a challenge for ethno-racially minoritized groups. And we have a great piece on that from the US by Deidre Anglin and Junie Olawoye, who are listed at the bottom here. But overall, our US-based research on diversity and intersectionality and psychosis is limited, and we need more. This is also a specific developmental context, as you know, so young people are transitioning to adulthood, and arguably they've become moral agents for the most part in their home communities with their families and, in high school with their friends. But young people in the US are expected to go out, to take risks, to leave their families, to experience life on their own terms and really redo their play, being the playwright of their own lives comes back into play. They have to go out and make decisions about who they want to be, what kind of audience they want. And so they're really trying to develop and accumulate moral agency all over again. This is really challenging for young people with early psychosis at the same time, who are experiencing that at the same time. So methodologically, I had a team that helped me with the ethnography. It included a postdoc and another colleague of mine who speaks Spanish fluently, and also several undergraduate and graduate students from SMU. So this is a wonderful team. We were able to collect 141 1 to 2 hour interviews at up to 4 different time points. And we made 75 community visits, have about 5,000 pages of interview data that we uploaded into Deduce, which is a cloud-based software. So we could, teams of us could code this incredible data set. And so we distilled this down to two groups. So when we got really specific about engagement, we were only really able to speak to 18 of the original 48. However, their demographics really matched the original 48, which is interesting. But we only felt comfortable saying whether or not people engaged or disengaged if they had done at least 4 interviews across the critical period, across the 3 months. And we'd been able to also talk to a key supporter just to kind of round out the perspective. And the criteria for considering someone engaged was that they had attended at least 3 follow-up appointments after their initial hospitalization during those initial 3 or 4 months. About 8 people did use services and engaged, and then about 10 people refused services and so dropped out altogether. And what we noticed is that they had a lot in common. People had different. Some people had both groups reported positive and negative interactions with doctors, positive and negative experiences of medications, positive and negative experiences of family or police involvement, or all these things were pretty similar for the 2 groups. And when we grouped them together, we noticed that there were 3. This is an article that we published about this in Psychiatric Services in 2019. But we noticed that there were 3 factors that were really crucial for everyone across this set of people that we have this deep data on. So all of them, the participants and the key supporters, were interested in getting back to normal. All of them thought that the care on offer was not enough. So there were not the specialty early psychosis services at this time were only for the most indigent people who had, didn't even have access to Medicaid. They had to be living well below the poverty level. So there weren't specialized services. I think only 2 out of the 48 even qualified for these programs at the time. So most of them felt the care was inadequate and that police involvement was distressing in the pathway to care. And then over here in the second column, you can see where young adults in particular, their top concern was to get back to normal, but then they were also really worried about paying for care. A lot of them were in between insurances at this time, and also just feeling disempowered about the experience that they'd had. And so my second argument is that my data suggests that the manifestation of and societal response to persons experiencing early psychosis constitute breaking points that have both medical and moral dimensions, and that if we can work on addressing these, we can work on addressing some of these high-ranking concerns that they have and that shape their decisions about treatment. So Sue Estroff says, Sue Estroff says in her book, Making It Crazy, she's a medical anthropologist. She worked with people with long-term psychiatric disability, and she found that most of what we know to be real is what we share with others. So psychosis is often quite relational. It's built in sort of consensus between people about what is reality and what is not reality. And one of the young people that I interviewed, her name was Amy. She in her story, she started off having, struggles with employment and with she didn't pursue an education, and she was working in retail for a long time. She had trouble staying in retail. She had helped one of her siblings raise their children. So her sister offered to let her come and stay with her and help raise her children because Amy was struggling. So Amy came, and she had been experiencing these sort of embodied zaps that she felt were her coworkers might be zapping her. And that was one of the reasons why she was having trouble at work. And she started to experience just general confusion, forgetfulness. And so she started sort of abusing a little bit her Adderall, or that's what her siblings think, because she was upset about her prescription running out early. And during this time, so she's struggling possibly with some negative symptoms with these embodied zaps. And then she sort of realizes one evening that her sister and her husband are being inappropriate during bedtime story time with their children. And she feels that they are molesting their children. And this idea really takes hold. And the zaps are in her brain, they're in her body. And she realizes that she's being zapped because she's a superhero, and that she's been sent to save her niece and nephew from her sister and her husband, who are molesting their children. So Amy calls, she confronts her sister and her husband, who of course deny this. She talks to the larger family. The larger family cannot get on board with Amy's version of reality. And she even calls the school nurse. Child Protective Services is called. None of this is confirmed in any way. Amy's sister is not molesting her children in consensual reality. So Amy has tried to take on moral agency in this case by envisioning herself as a superhero. She's tried to become the playwright of her own life, as she's supposed to do as a young adult. She's had a lot of failures in employment and other areas, but now she's a superhero. She's here to save her niece and nephew from their parents who are molesting them. But she can't get the audience she needs to confirm this role. And so she doesn't have a chance to practice her role or to try and fail at being a superhero, because no one is buying into this version of reality. So Margaret Urban Walker is a philosopher, and she talks about how we need to have moral understandings between us. This is part of the social, agreement that we have, at least in Western neoliberal culture, that we're expected to keep on keeping straight who we are and who we have given others to understand we are in moral terms. We also need to sustain or refurbish our understanding of moral terms themselves, of what it means to talk about kindness, respect, friendship, or obligation. And in this case, Amy has not done this with her family. She's not being kind or respectful or friendly or upholding her obligations as a sister from their perspective. And so they're really struggling. This is causing a lot of problems. And I would argue and have argued that this constitutes both a mental breakdown. Amy's clearly having a break with reality, but she's also having a moral breakdown in her relationships with the people around her. So the shared sense that Amy is a good enough person, that she's a moral agent, is being lost, and it's diminishing, and she has very little control over that. In fact, what she's trying to do to replenish it, to see herself, re-script herself as a superhero, is failing. It's a strategy that she's employing and it's not working. So the manifestation of these kinds of symptoms, I'm arguing, have both medical and moral dimensions. So we can clearly see that she's having, what we would call delusions or hallucinations, embodied experiences. But for Amy, these are really compelling. And so the young people that I talked to, they talked about how it was very slow to come on. At first, it seemed like a very gentle kind of ocean that was appealing and attractive, that seemed like a good place to go hang out and kind of get distracted by. So here's James at the state hospital. He says, so that's the worst part. That voice sounds believable. So we start believing in it. And since you're in that psychosis, you're already psychotic. You just believe it without a doubt because it's in your mind. So you're like, you just believe your own mind, And so it seems logical that you would believe something that your own mind is telling you. But then this becomes more intense, as with Amy. She has embodied zaps, and she starts having brain zaps. Are her coworkers zapping her? Is her sister molesting her children? This is getting more intense and overwhelming. So this is Karina, another young person. She said, my brain, it felt like an amoeba, and you don't know how long it's going to last. You can't necessarily control your body, just can't function. Like, you can't do anything really. All you can do is sit there and try not to freak out. So Karina's describing how, this, what was once a nice, fun, playful thing to engage with has become this incredibly overwhelming sensory overload that is not comfortable or pleasant in any way. And that's very much a difficult thing to try and manage. So here we have Marcus, who we're talking to him in the hospital at this point, and he says he's trying to describe to us how he's a good person. He wants to be the best that I can be. That's great. I want to prove that I'm the best one to do it. Keep working with people I need to work with so that I can have my business at all times. Stay focused. And then he just has this really long pause. He's not looking at the interviewer. Are you distracted by someone? The interviewer is asking, and Marcus says, mm-hmm. And the interviewer says, who is it? And someone who guides me. Guides you yet? Yeah. So Marcus has experienced this breaking point. He's unable to sort of keep track of, what is consensus reality, what is non-consensus reality. It's very, very hard. You can see that he's trying to express his moral agency that he knows he's supposed to have as a young person, but it's really getting clouded by this other experience. So Amy's having a similar crisis. The wave is huge, and her sister has asked her to leave her house. They sent her to a homeless shelter for a couple of days. She's being bused to another city to join her brother, whose kids she took care of earlier, agrees that Amy needs further help. They're just trying to figure out what to do. And Amy gets off the bus, and instead of going to the train to go to her brother's house, she finds herself on a highway overpass. It just popped in my head. I should jump off the bridge to see if it's real, to prove that it's not real. I didn't do it, but I could have. I'm sure lots of people do. I'm sure there's lots of worse stories. And so luckily Amy didn't jump off to test, her version of herself as a superhero, but she was so convinced that she was actually a good person that was trying to help other people that it seemed plausible that maybe she should jump off and see if she could fly. She was really wondering if maybe she could fly. So obviously the way that the symptoms have stacked up for people have seriously compromised their sense of moral agency, their relationships with other people, their relationship with themselves. Then our societal response to that set of symptoms also has medical and moral dimensions that are very complicated for a young person's moral agency. So after Amy decides not to jump off the bridge, she sees some police officers nearby. She asks them for help. And so they took me to the hospital, and okay, the police took you in there. Yeah. And of course they admitted me. I was going crazy. And the first night they admitted me, they had a camera where they had to take a picture. And I guess it set me off, and I tried to smash it, and they put me in 4-point restraints. Oh, yeah. So how do you feel now about what they've done? It's pretty humiliating. Yeah. So this kind of setup of emergency response that the police had to engage in because of the way our system is set up was demoralizing for Amy. It took away her sense of moral agency. Here's another young woman who says, okay, I wanted to go to therapy, but having the police come, since I don't like authority figures, and I think a lot of people don't like authority figures, period, I think that added to my hostility. I was at the breaking point, she even uses the word, where I needed help. I would have gone to therapy, but I don't know if I would have gone to a hospital. So Miranda here would have liked to have some more options besides going to the emergency room and having the police come and get her. Here is Gideon, who's about 19. He talks about how he wants to go study chemistry or psychology. And then he says that his experience has raised his interest in psychology, where he wants to help people because he feels that this kind of institutional intervention with young persons prevents them from feeling good about themselves. He said, it's like you're torn apart from the world. It makes things worse. You can't even go to the bathroom without someone swiping a card. It's too much. It just destroys you. I think it makes you mentally disturbed. So here they're telling us how the societal response has troubled them and their sense of, for Gideon here, his social basis of self-respect, his sense that his audience respects and supports him. Here's Miranda's mom, who's her key supporter, and she's saying that they needed more resources in order to let Miranda come back and try and fail after this incredible event that happened with their family. Everyone has this really powerful event that happens that was quite dangerous, that results in these really tricky situations for families afterwards, and they don't have family support. She says, we didn't know how to communicate with her when she was psychotic. I was scared I'd say the wrong thing. And again, it was like we were walking on eggshells. There's just not resources out there for families, I don't think. So these are things, I'm giving you individual quotes, but these are things that were happening across many participants. And so these are patterns that we're seeing across people in the data set. I'm just using individuals to present that to you. So I'm arguing that there's a medical experience that obviously needs to be addressed, with medication, with some kind of intervention. And there's also a moral dimension to this that's really important to people. So this slide kind of sorts out how some of these are medical events and some of these are moral events, but they're all happening at the same time to someone who's trying to become a moral agent. So some of the young people refused treatment. They refused to come back into any kind of engagement with mental health services. Some of them came back once and then left. But what I found, as I mentioned earlier, is that both users and refusers had similar experiences of these sort of medical and moral dimensions of experience. But then afterwards, the way they made decisions about care was depended on whether or not using care helped them replenish their sense of moral agency. So refusers were actively seeking to preserve or restore their moral agency by refusing care. And users were seeking to actively preserve or restore their moral agency by accepting care. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each group. So the refusers refused care if it didn't match up with the way that they were scripting their own life story. So Daphne here, she's talking about how care compromised her sense of autobiographical power. Me as a person, I don't like being on drugs. I don't like taking pills, medicine. Growing up in my childhood, I never had to go to the hospital, never. So now showing up and going to these appointments and stuff, I don't like it. That's just from a person that don't hardly go around clinics and stuff. So she's just not a person who uses clinics. That's not part of her story. That's not part of her self-perception. She's not going to do it. Here we have Michael. Michael was really concerned about one of the side effects, which was sexual impotence, and his version of his future self, his sense of moral agency, his sense of self-respect was sort of centered around becoming a father and a husband. And he felt that this medication was not enabling him to reach toward that goal. In fact, he's so troubled by it that he says if the government just had an island, just took people with mental illness, just put them on an island to just live out the rest of our lives like that, if they'd have done that, I wouldn't even know the difference. And so he was thinking that, he would still like to have his male organs working like he's a man, because that's really what makes life worth living for him and his definition of moral agency. And then other refusers I found refused partly because of their families, the people around them, the communities that matter to them, that they wanted to sort of have support them as they continue to try and fail to become a young adult, a valued adult. They needed their communities. If their communities didn't want them to use medications or to engage with mental health care, then they did not, even if they kind of knew they needed it. So Elijah was under a lot of pressure. His mom didn't pick up his prescription, and she said they just needed to keep praying. They were going to pray it away. Sometimes I will insist, she said. Sometimes I will leave him alone. I tell you, there's nothing prayer cannot do, nothing. If you believe in God and believe in God solely and walk in the right path, enemies will come like a flood, but God will lift his hand and move all of them. And eventually he will succeed. It was too risky for Elijah to give up his mom's support, to give up his church's support, to take the medication and pursue treatment. And so he did not. So Ariana also refused, and she ended up doing pretty well. But she had to sort of take control of her narrative. She was even trying to do that early on. She's telling me early on in this interaction that she's a good person. I'm just mindful of time here, so I might skip over Ariana's story. Hopefully you're getting the sense that young people are trying to be a good person. They're trying to be a good person when they're in the hospital. That's how they're interpreting their psychotic experiences. They're a superhero. They're an angel. Here Ariana says she's a good girl trying to save the world. Then they need to stay connected to their communities. And if refusing helps them do that, in this case, Ariana is able to stay connected with her brother, because in her Hispanic community, there's not a lot of gradation. You're either crazy or you're not crazy. So Ariana did not want to be considered crazy, so she refused mental health care, because otherwise she would have gone to the crazy house. And so they just had to joke about it, and her brother helped her become a caregiver in his household. And so far she seemed to be doing okay, but I only followed them for 4 to 6 months, so I don't have a long-term follow-up. So refusing treatment did not work well for everyone. I'm not saying that treatment's bad. Many people needed and at times desired mental health treatment, but it became very complicated with their loved ones, whether or not that was something they would pursue. And refusing treatment was always a strategy to help replenish their lost moral agency from the crisis and the initial response to it. So users, luckily I kept this part really short, but users use services. So what I found is that the people who use services typically had a family history of mental health concerns. So they recognized and were worried about, oh, what happened to my aunt might happen to me. And so I better take my medication and go into treatment. And a lot of times families made this contingent, made material support like housing or transportation or even, funding their cell phone contingent on them using treatment. And if they needed that support, if that was important to them, then they would use the services. And also some communities, as Hansen and Bourgois and Drucker have pointed out in the past, embrace a disability income as a means of financial support for when people are considered to be, unable to support themselves. And so if their family was supportive of them, here we have Calista, who talks about getting a paycheck from the government to support her daughter, just like her aunt, who also gets a paycheck. And so in this case, using was seen was something that could give you autobiographical power and the social basis of self-respect in communities that were impoverished. Okay, so just to wrap up, to better engage young persons in treatment, we need to focus on the moral and medical dimensions of care. So here are some suggestions to improve engagement. So obviously young people are really invested in getting back to normal or to something even better than what they were before. And so I think that there's many ways to do this. I think we want to listen more closely to what their story is, what's at stake for them in terms of moral agency, and then offer care that maybe will ease them into the medical world a little more gently, like mutual support groups, groups based in the community, like Hearing Voices groups, using faith-based interventions. A lot of the pastors that I talked to were very interested in learning how to better support families, using both prayer and their relationship with the family to help someone, but also connecting them to mental health services, because the pastors were overwhelmed by these symptoms as well. They weren't sure what to do, so they asked for more training. And also offering people ways to express themselves that maybe aren't verbal, like digital storytelling or arts-based interventions. Also just trying to think more about how we provide care. What is the role of police in care? Restraints, unnecessary hospitalizations, labeling people with psychotic disorder. Are all these really necessary at this very early moment in time? I think long-acting injectables turn people off a lot, especially if that was given to them involuntarily because it lasted so long, or right across the critical period, they weren't feeling good because of the injection, and so they didn't want to go back. Helping them repair the relationships that they need to thrive once they come out. Working with families, possibly doing home visits, maybe considering using the open dialogue model that seems to have some evidence for success and is being tried in many parts of the world now. And also just letting people maybe say no to medication at first. We can start with offering moral support and then work towards getting medical support after, the emergency has passed. So here are a few potential tools, just a list. I also think that mental health insurance should be universal, that no one should be worried about paying for care after a psychotic crisis. That just seems inhumane to me. And yeah, so that is my presentation. I've made my 3 main points, and I think the rough news is that we have a lot of work to do, but the good news is that there's so much that we can do to make the situation better if we just put our minds to it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Neely. Really important information. Terrific. I have a couple of questions, but I think I'll start with our chat questions from the audience. It's really great, the amount of engagement we've had today from this big audience. So thank you all for your chat questions. Keep them coming. You'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So Neely, the first question from Dr. Luxembourg takes us all the way back to the beginning to look at the early intervention impact. It looked like your data showed, did 30% not show up later for early intervention and 70% did show up. Dr. Luxembourg says 70% is great. Also a question about the age at which early intervention began. She says, we saw kids as young as 3 at NPI decades ago. So earliest age as well for early intervention.
Yeah, so at this time, there weren't a lot of this sort of at-risk or high-risk psychosis programs that we're seeing, that were explicitly targeting younger people under 18. Our study was restricted to 18 to 30. I think the research on 30% not coming back, that comes from a systematic review. So I'd have to look back into the disengagement. I think, around the world, a piece in the World Psychiatric Association journal by Lisa Dixon found more like, possibly 30 to 40, 50, 60%. So I think even more research needs to be done, but it is clear that somewhere between 30 and 50% are not coming back or don't want to engage in services. But I agree 70% is promising.
On that note, I had a quick question for you about the early survey results where you ranked recommendations from young people and from all the participants about how to improve the experience. And what was quite high on that list actually was that the care on offer is not enough. Right. And I think you contextualize that a bit in the later data, but I wonder if you could speak more to that, because we often hear or connect to those stories of, I no longer want to take the injection, I'm going to refuse care and not come back. And so how do you make sense of this wish for actually, what's offered is not enough? What do you think that means?
Yeah, so I think that people were frustrated by just sort of the general lack of support. So they felt like they went in, they had, 15 minutes with a psychiatrist that was employed by the hospital who assigned them a diagnosis of psychotic disorder and then handed them some prescriptions, and then they were discharged when they were stable enough to go with, a suggestion for a follow-up appointment. And a lot of people were just at a complete loss after that. There had been this tremendous catalytic event that had led people to go into these emergency situations to start with. So I think even just what people expected when they went to look for care was, this kind of hospitalization is very different from a normal hospitalization. There's locked doors, there's rules and restrictions, families can't go in with you. Even just starting at that basic level of like what one expects when one goes to the hospital. The lack of interaction with the doctor for the family, for the young person. And then I think because we were making home visits, I think a lot of the families wished, that home visits could be made, and that there were peer support. We asked them about peer support. Would it help to see someone who's been through this before, who can encourage you? Yes, that would help so much. Would it help to talk to another mom who's been through this and could encourage you? Yes, that would help so much. So there was this sense that like there needed to be more community-based mutual support, just to try and navigate these confusions. And I don't think it's all on psychiatrists at all to provide care writ large. It's on a much larger system of support that could be in place.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's the kind of care that matters. Okay, great. Let me work through our questions here as well from Michael Agres. I've said your last name correctly. Given the critical nature of this early period of risk and opportunity, given the distressing early dropout rates in the best of circumstances, and given that we now have long-acting injectables that can be effective for up to 6 months, so ultra long-acting injectables that don't require very frequent readministration, would it not make sense to routinely use this approach early on? And how would this interface with the need for moral agency?
So this is a little bit anecdotal, because about 6 of our young persons were given a long-acting injectable, but by and large, all of them did not like it. So they felt that, so we did notice a pattern that all of them were given the injectable involuntarily, after refusing medication for a certain amount of time. And then the judge would say, okay, yes, you can forcibly medicate, and then they would receive this. So it was not desired or given with permission, and I don't think that helped, but they felt that the side effects were very powerful, that they'd sort of been put in a kind of chemical straitjacket that lasted well. And so I'm actually nervous about the 6 month. I think even the 30-day, the 3 month was very hard because it's, they experienced it as physical heaviness and brain fog and exhaustion and just not being themselves. And it was not clear if this was, an aftermath of the psychosis or an aftermath of the long-acting injectable. And so I think really careful research needs to be done before that's a frontline approach. Given, thinking about how empowering is it for someone if they're forcibly medicated with something that lasts for 6 months and has some significant side effects, possibly with more research.
Okay, thank you. And from Dr. McGovern, what would you consider unique and possibly overlapping features of this moral agency-based approach versus other treatments that might directly internalized or perceived stigma of a mental health diagnosis? So what would you consider unique and maybe overlapping features of moral agency compared to other treatments that might focus, for instance, on perceived stigma?
Well, I think that perceived stigma would be an important part of promoting moral agency. And I think cross-culturally, stigma is a big piece of moral agency. It's not the only piece, but if communities either don't trust medicine, or if they think that, or if telling someone that they have a problem that's so for example, yesterday I was talking to a woman who had been a social worker with Latino families, and she was saying that a lot of times people think it's fine to have these sort of magical thinking, non-consensual reality, spiritual, supernatural experiences in Mexico, but then they come here and they're labeled as psychosis. That's very distressing for the family. Then they're worried about it, and they weren't before. And I'm not saying that that young person doesn't need attention or treatment, but I think we need to think about how the family and the culture's response to being labeled as sick might, have a negative impact on their moral agency. And can we do this without saying they're sick necessarily? Do we have to put a psychosis label on there? You tell someone they have psychosis and then they Google that and it's a big distress.
Well, that's an interesting perspective into which to introduce this question from Jordan Schwartz, which is an interesting one. How do you feel about the rising popularity of psychedelics potentially inducing psychosis in these at-risk groups? Maybe you have some data or experience around psychedelic use and how that shapes a psychosis experience in your subjects or generally. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my current research is funded by the NIH as part of a network of 100 clinics around the US looking at early psychosis. It's called EpiNet. And so they're trying to sort of collect and harmonize data on outcomes and things like that. But I'm in my hub, which is EpiNet Texas of 16 clinics, I'm researching substance use and early psychosis. So we're both looking at substance use, quantitatively on a national level, and then qualitatively in Texas with very diverse groups of people. And I think the biggest concern right now, at least in the conversations I'm in at the national level and the local level, are this incredibly high amount of cannabis use, actually, that the young people that I've been interviewing perceive as medicinal. And yet it seems to be exacerbating their psychotic symptoms. Oh, okay, the birds did start talking to me after I smoked, but I was more relaxed. And so there's all these ambivalences around cannabis that I think need to be worked out. It's also illegal in some places, which has more social consequences. Psychedelics, I know most people exclude people with psychosis from, the clinical trials they do for MDMA and for psilocybin. So I think I'm by no means anti-psychedelic or anti-cannabis, but I think it's definitely worth thinking about. And I know in our one of our team's projects right now is to try to create a substance use toolkit that gives peer specialists information that will help them advise young people on how to safely use, in a harm reduction approach, cannabis psychedelics. So if anyone has any resources, please send them to me. We're trying to assemble, not reinvent the wheel, but rather assemble what's out there. So I'm just moving to my contact again. That was a great question. Thank you.
It is a great question and just highlights the theme in a way of ambivalence and a couple of different feelings about experiences of care and among the young people you highlighted.
I realized I should add, it seemed like LSD misuse was the few people in the study who had that it was very complicated. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Dr. Keck. Long ago, there was a concept of EE, expressed emotion, on the part of families as an important factor affecting rehospitalization after discharge. Have you looked at or worked on modifying this aspect of family involvement with respect to initial onset?
Yeah, so one of the chapters in my book actually talks about expressed emotion and models of expressed emotion. I mean, I've had family groups tell me that, NAMI folks and others tell me that was actually a very painful set of research for them because it suggested that they'd somehow harmed their child. And so I looked into, I do think that we need to, maybe rather than focusing on expressed emotion, which is something that happens, that maybe families could experience as stigmatizing or painful, that we could focus on sort of this process, on caregiver burden and on the process of mourning and grief that does happen after their child receives this very scary diagnosis. And then they've had these really scary experiences with their child. Partly, I think, because we haven't intervened early enough and people are afraid to go ask for help early. So there's a lot of pieces of the book that are looking at all these different, what I'm calling breaking points along the path where we could, offer more supports and do better. So I do think expressed emotion research is really interesting. And I think building off of it in a way that's sort of trauma informed for families who've been largely traumatized and so don't want to be accused of doing something wrong will be really important to get families engaged, and engaged. Even for my research, when the family was involved in helping them connect with me, I was able to connect with them. And the same goes for care.
Yeah, thank you. There's this long tail of approaches that sometimes are, from families' point of view, feels like they are blaming, and that undermines a lot of the currents you're trying to highlight here as more therapeutic.
Yeah.
Time for one last question. Thank you, Dr. Luxembourg, for this follow-up. It's an interesting one. Can you specify what their normal was? Was it being in school, working, or having no direction? And what percent? So specific question here about what was the normal to which your participants wanted to return, but also I wonder if you have broader thoughts about that too. What is the idea of normal that sort of circulates among the people you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we tried to give a recovery oriented sort of moral agency building interview when we talked to them. And so our last question was always, where do you envision your life 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years from now? And what supports do you need to get there? And I would say, by and large, the future normal would be, emerging into valued adulthood, having their own place to live and having a family. And for some of them, a college degree, for some of them, a meaningful job. But by and large, they were describing, the importance of intimate relationships and how much they were longing for that sense of belonging with another person. I don't know if it was the vulnerability of the moment and their fear that maybe they would never be able to have that. But it was touching and sort of highlighted the importance of moral agency for me, that was kind of what mattered most to them, were these intimate relationships. Some of them were in pain over what they could see on, especially former social media. They could see who they were before. They could see, oh, look, everyone used to like what I posted and I don't even recognize myself. And who is that person? And so I think helping people sort of mourn and reflect and move forward will be really important for engaging them and helping them, just repair some of the things that were broken along the way with family and friends. And I didn't mention this here, but including social media mistakes. I'm not sure how we clear those up, but if you posted a lot of things on Facebook that are egregious, it's really, you can't clear them off. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Neely. Thanks. Let's give a round of applause for Dr. Myers. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, again, timely, very important, interesting. We've ended on the social media angle, something new. We're trying to better understand how to work with young people around. So wonderful work. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.